We're excited to have you here today with us. Today we have a panel presentation, and our purpose and our topic today is the state of public education and how and why has it dramatically been changing, progressively as well as regressively, and how do the current culminated effects show up in our schools and for our students. We're going to focus today on the impacts on kids, on educators, on systems, and we'll take a national, global, and local look. And we'll talk about what this has to do with social justice. We're going to tell stories today to you, the viewers, so you can connect to what's really happening in relationship to the bigger picture things that we'll be discussing. And now we'll introduce our panel members. We'll start over here with Hyung Nam. And Hyung teaches social studies at Wilson High School in Portland, Oregon. And he participates in many local social justice activist groups and serves as a board member of Healthcare for All Oregon. His interests are in both teaching for social justice and organizing for better public education. He's an active member of PAT, the Portland Association of Teachers, OEA, the union for our state, Portland Area Rethinking Schools, Northwest Teaching for Social Justice Conference Organizing Committee, that's a mouthful, and a former member of the editorial board of Rethinking Schools. So welcome, Hyung.
Thanks.
And next to Hyung, we have GM Garcia. And GM came to the Pacific Northwest 20 years ago to teach bilingual education. She served as a statewide distinguished educator for school improvement, supporting schools identified as high poverty and low performing. She has years of professional experience working with Title I high poverty schools and teaching English as a second language. GM started and served as principal of a successful bilingual magnet school, which has since been replicated and recognized. She served as director of dual immersion, K-12, for Portland's largest public school district, Oregon's largest public school district, which is Portland, and served as president of the Oregon Association for Bilingual Education. She's currently a sought-after consultant and trainer working with parents and school staff. Next, we have Jessie Hagopian. Jessie teaches history and is the advisor to the Black Student Union at Garfield High School in Seattle. And Garfield is the site of the historic boycott of the MAP test in 2013. He's an acclaimed associate editor for Rethinking Schools magazine. He's the editor and contributing author to More Than a Score. You might want to show that. More Than a Score, the new uprising against high-stakes testing. And he's founding member of Social Equity Educators. Jessie's won many prestigious awards for excellence and innovation in peace education, for courageous leadership. He's won the NAACP Service Award for Seattle King County. He serves as Education Fellow to the Progressive Magazine, as well as Cultural Freedom Fellow for the Lannan Foundation for his nationally recognized work in promoting critical thinking and opposing high-stakes testing. Welcome, Jessie. And then we're also very lucky to have Sarina Walters with us. Sarina is a high school senior at Riverdale High School in the Portland area here, and a member of the National Honor Society. She's a recognized student leader with a focused interest in organizing students to opt out of high-stakes standardized testing. Sarina is committed to raising awareness of what really stands in the way of closing the educational achievement gap and inspiring all students, but especially students with privilege, to play a role in working towards closing it. Sarina is from a biracial, bicultural family and is particularly concerned with the ways that our current education system is designed to support the success of a narrow strata of the population.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarina. And over here we have Teressa Raiford, sorry. Teressa is a Portland native. She's a community advocate and activist, and she is founder and leader of Don't Shoot PDX, which is an organization of citizen advocates united in protest against racism, police brutality, and state violence. Teressa is a mother of grown children and has a professional background in business consulting and operations. Teressa's campaigns for the Portland City Council in 2012 and 2014 put the issues of real people in the forefront of political discussion. She's involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, Oregon Assembly for Black Affairs, Unite Women, and most importantly, Teressa is a tireless advocate for community members, focused on the needs of youth, those in foster care, navigating the healthcare system, and mitigating all the effects of poverty. So we have a very wonderful panel to have some really rich discussion with today. So I want us to start, folks, by painting the big picture for our viewers today. We're going to talk about what's currently going on in our schools and our systems. How have things changed over time for kids, for parents, for within government? How have our policies and practices and methodologies and culture really changed? Where are we now? And I'm going to ask you to start us off, Jesse.
Happy to. Yeah, I think we have gone down a really dangerous path in the education reform debate here in the United States and really around the world. And the danger of the way the discussion is being framed right now was really driven home for me last year when my 5-year-old then entered kindergarten. And, you know, I'd been active on these issues for some time, but it was driven home in a very personal and particular way for me when my son started kindergarten. And he began at a school that was being transformed into a Spanish immersion and Mandarin immersion elementary school. And so they actually had this big ribbon cutting ceremony to announce the beginning of this new international school. And it was a wonderful event in many ways. They had the entire school out on the front lawn, and they had these wonderful cultural performances from South America and from China, the students doing songs and dances to help kick off this new beginning. And all of these politicians were there to celebrate the beginning of this school. And the principal gave a great speech, and the teachers spoke passionately about the promise of this new school and the new language immersion program. And then the governor's education aide took the podium to address all of the students. And she leans into the microphone and she says, "Congratulations to all of you students for choosing this language immersion program, because now you will be ready for the global economy," right? And to me, that really drove home what they want to do to my kid. This education system is about making my student compete in a global system to get them ready to make some corporation fabulously wealthy, right? I thought I was sending him to this Spanish immersion program so he could learn to communicate with more people on the planet, so that he could learn to collaborate and work together, not to hold somebody else's child in Mexico down, right? But to be able to work together. And that's the philosophy of this global competition that's really underlying most of what we hear about as education reform in the United States today. And that was really driven home to me by something that Bill Gates said. You know, Bill Gates, richest man in the world, and has decided that he's going to use a large share of his wealth to privatize education and to standardize it. And he explained the importance of the new Common Core curriculum in a comment that I think should give us all pause and really make us reflect on the debate that we're having. And he said, explaining why we need Common Core, he said, if we had 50 different plug types, then appliances wouldn't get made and they'd be very expensive. But if we can have one type of plug one type of electrical outlet, then competition ensues and innovation, and then you can have wonderful appliances. And that was an incredible analogy, a beautiful analogy if our kids were electrical outlets, right? But our kids happen to be living, breathing human beings with passions and visions and talents that need nurturing, and not any single one of them is the same as the other. And so this drive to standardize the curriculum and to reduce the intellectual and emotional process of teaching and learning to a single score is really misguided, and it rests on a set of fundamentally flawed assumptions.
Yes.
And I think that's really what we're up against, is redefining the purpose of education, not to promote global competition, but to empower our kids to solve problems in their community, in their society. And there's no shortage of dramatic problems that we face today, and our education system, in my mind, needs to be not about promoting more competition, but about helping our kids develop the skills they need, whether it's leadership, creativity, critical thinking, that we're going to need to solve these problems.
Yeah, what a great example. Some of our viewers have children in the school system. They may be grandparents or parents that are closely connected, and some of them may not be as connected. So I think this real life example is really helpful. I wonder if other panel members have examples of how have our schools changed, recently? What are some of the things that we're seeing that are problematic in school environments? We talked about the Common Core state standards and how that's really creating a kind of a put your child in a peg approach to education. What are some of the other things that we're seeing in the schools?
Well, I'd like to just jump in and just make a connection between what's happening inside schools and what's happening outside, because I think that's really important. On the one hand, they talk about we need to be, compete in the global economy, but on the other hand, right, the latest statistics that have come out right now have said that the 20 richest Americans, including people like Bill Gates, own more wealth than half of all Americans. Think about that. 20 richest people own more wealth than half of, we're talking about 160 million Americans. So we're living in these times of record inequality, where over the last 30 years they've been cutting taxes on the wealthy. They've been, the system is rigged to produce extreme inequality, and they're talking about every child succeeds or no child left behind, or every student succeeds or no child left behind. The US is number 34 out of 35 in the OECD countries for child poverty. And so how can they talk about not leaving children behind when this is what our society does outside the classroom, outside the school? So I think what we're seeing happening in schools is directly connected to what's happening outside. Yeah. And I think really what's happening is students are being set up. There's no way the majority of the students could succeed within the system. If every single student in my class, or all of our classes got A's and aced all their tests, there'd be a crisis. On the one hand, we think that this is exactly what they want, but it would be a nightmare for them, because the whole purpose of these school reforms and testing and so forth is to rank and sort students to justify the inequality that exists. And that's really, we have to talk about the enormous inequality, where people's lives really don't even matter outside the classroom. So we have to think about what's happening inside the classroom in parallel with what's happening outside, I think.
Yeah, and I think, to expand on that a little further too, maybe we can draw some connections between what is the role of corporate interest in education, and how is corporate interest influencing education?
Yeah, I'd be happy to expand a little bit more on that. I completely agree that the schools are in a context of a society that is vastly unequal, and we see that inequality reproduced inside the schools. And really, since the No Child Left Behind Act came online, we've seen an explosion of profiteering from public education. And you know, I began teaching in 2001, the same year that No Child Left Behind was brought online. And so my entire career as a teacher has been marked by this ranking and sorting system, as you called it, using test scores to test and punish our kids rather than nurture them. And the impact of that has been catastrophic on public education. You know, teachers in national surveys show very high levels of dissatisfaction, and teacher turnover is at record rates. We've seen everything that really matters in education pushed out, defunded, underfunded. You know, funding for the arts disappears, and because the tested subjects of math and reading are all that matter to the testing profiteers, that's what gets focused on. And so physical education and art and civics and so many other important aspects of education are pushed to the side, and maybe most tragically, recess is disappearing. You know, there was a study in Seattle that showed, you know, many schools had less than 20 minutes of recess left. And it actually took a great uprising of parents and teachers uniting and fighting back to win 30 minutes of recess for the kids. And these are the impacts when education policy is driven by this data-crazed culture that wants to label our kids a score rather than nurture their intellect.
And to make the connection, so we talked about profiteering, and can we make the connection for our viewers about what does that look like? We're talking about how it's happening, but what are behind the scenes? How is that happening? What are the ways that corporate interest is influencing the way the direction of education is going?
Well, you know, one thing, I mean, there's so much to this, but there's profiteering opportunities, you know, at every angle, but one that's really interesting if you think about who the people are that are pushing charter schools, for instance. I mean, I have an acquaintance from high school who when I went to my high school reunion, discovered that he works in education after going to Georgetown Law School and working for the Clinton administration. And I found out, you know, what do you do for education? And you live in Beverly Hills? Well, it turned out that he was working for Parent Revolution, where they get all this money from the Broads, the Waltons, and the Gates Foundation, and he makes a six-figure salary with a staff of, I don't know, you know, a dozen people to go into South Central LA and fool parents into signing a petition. If they get 51% of the parents to sign this petition, they basically shut down the public schools and turn them into charter schools. So some of the interest behind charter schools, we have billionaires, we have Wall Street hedge funds, and I mean, here's an example. There's this, the New York Times has done these stories about all this foreign money, everyone from Russian oligarchs to corrupt dictators and so on, millionaires and billionaires of the world buying these expensive high-rise apartments in New York City, you know, for millions of dollars and having them sit empty. Well, you know, there's the system is rigged to encourage charter schools with this kind of money. So here's one example. A new federal program called the EB-5 allows wealthy foreigners to purchase immigration visas for themselves and their families if they invest at least $500,000 in charter schools. Under another program, the Community Relief Tax Relief Act, that was passed under Clinton, basically gives corporations a 39% tax credit if they invest in charter schools in underserved communities. So there's a flood of money entering in, and you know, opportunities to make money from. Of course, we have giants like Pearson, the publishing, the testing, you know, all these contracts that they charge basically public tax dollars for which they're completely unaccountable as private entities.
And it sounds like the general population is getting fooled a bit, because it sounds like what we're seeing is education nonprofits that look as though they're doing great things for children. Names like Stand for Children make you think, oh, what could be better than that? But actually what's happening is that these educational nonprofits are largely funded by the business interests funneling money into them. And they're actually working to serve corporate interests. Am I understanding that correctly?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, you know, in a lot of ways, it's been like this for a long time. If you look at some of the early shaping of public education, it was by the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and so on, right? So while they're murdering the parents of students, whether at Ludlow, the miners that they're attacked and literally murdered, we're talking about class war, or you know, same thing with Andrew Carnegie at the Homestead Steel Mills. On the other hand, they were at least honest about public education back then, because they weren't saying that the purpose of public education was to, you know, make the children of miners somehow become, you know, philosophers or doctors. The purpose of public education back then, they were clear, was to train the young to be obedient factory workers.
Right.
I want to open it up to our other panel members as we're talking about what's happening currently. What do you want to add to the conversation?
Well, I was going to say basically that in the power structure that we have now, as far as Americans and the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of other movements for human rights, I think that we need to start being extremely intentional about not only understanding what's happening in our education system, but using that power of unity and that communication that we're bridging to dismantle these systems. Because my whole thought is, how much longer, I mean, how much time actually would it take us to take this back from where it's at now? It's like this is an operational plan that's been standard. It works the way that it needs to. You see the children's literacy rates that are rising as far as their literacy. They're not graduating. So all of the components and outcomes from the standardized testing and the way that we influence corporations to get into the interest of poverty through our education system, it's working for them. But how do we start using our power of awareness to start dismantling these systems? How do we bridge the communication and start leveling it off with educating our parents? Because part of this system is bringing them out of the parenting and guardianship of the students. I'm learning from the advocacy that I do that there are systems in place that disregard the necessity of a parent being there as an informed part of this child's outcome. And so you have these for-profit and nonprofit organizations that say, hey, we're cultural competency. And then you ask them, well, if you're in the school, you're the direct line of defense or support for the families. Why aren't you engaging with the families in a way that's going to change the behaviors that are happening within the school? Why aren't you working directly with the families to create solutions that they can take home and use within their communities to change the outcomes that are happening? Because if we as a society don't realize that the generation of students like Sarina are our future, and that we're not intentionally determining what that needs to look like and what we can do to be held accountable, then we're just setting ourselves up for losing while we talk about the situation. And so my whole thing is that when are we going to use the power that we have to influence accountability from our side? We can dismantle a lot of these issues. I know that with our movement, we've shut down school board meetings and then even encouraged parents and community to, you know, invest in voting in their own school board members, people from their communities that they trusted, and then taking advantage of sitting on teaching and learning committees and asking for audits that have to do with equity. People got mad at us for asking for audits, but we knew that the children that those equity dollars were focused on were not achieving any kind of successful outcomes, even though there was millions of dollars that was legislated to be available to them because of the problems that we're talking about. So I'm just, you know, thinking towards the intentionality of groups like ours and the power of this type of panel and outreach.
You know, when I go out and talk to parents about these issues, some very, you know, strongly civic-minded parents will say, but you know, I've heard from my principal, from folks out there that what we're working towards here with these standards and with this emphasis on assessment is rigorous expectations for, we want to raise the bar, and kids who have been historically left behind, kids of color, kids in poverty, are the ones that are going to, you know, really be helped by education
We know
reform.
we're lab rats. We know that they're picking on us because we're the most vulnerable. There's problems right now with applications for sponsorships and scholarships that children want so that they can take, just extracurricular field trips. I mean, if you're living in poverty, you're subject to filling out an application that basically says, hey, your child has no privacy. We're going to share all this information with several different agencies because we're reimbursing the $5 for this field trip. And so, I mean, you have things like FERPA and different things like that. Our education system has become a data tank for information systems. And a lot of that information system, data information, is for federal dollars that deal with poverty. They have nothing to do with outcomes. And when we talk about breaking down ranking or filtering out our community, we can hurt the people that live in poverty. We can live off of whatever we project that poverty is going to lead them to in the next 10 to 15 years. I've been at meetings that are at the Juvenile Justice Center where PPS, our Department of Education, our FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, everybody's sitting at the table trying to evaluate how children that are 11 years old to 15-year-olds are going to occupy spaces in prisons.
So the tracking.
And this whole core standardized testing and everything else is all relative to the same system. So we have to start intentionally breaking out of that system. We have to break those ties that bind that funding, because we're thinking that when money comes in and there's a lot of it coming for a special program, we have to understand that it's for research. It's not for the program. Well, let's see how well it works and, see what we can do with it. But if it's successful, it's not going to last, and we know that.
I was thinking back to, I was teaching during the Improving America Schools Act, so that shows my age, but one thing that's always been the same in the Elementary Ed Secondary Act is that we have to be accountable to the 4 categories: kids who live in poverty, kids who are of color, kids who speak a language other than English, and those kids who have special needs as identified as on an IEP. But I remember when we went from Improving America's Schools Act to No Child Left Behind, accountability and shining the light on our failures was the big deal. But if you remember, this was before we declared war. So this was intended to be a funded, there was no funding for No Child Left Behind, but it was also such a penalty-based system. But one of the things that I saw change over time, both as an educator, a teacher on special assignment, working with schools, as well as in the classroom, is this push towards what they called externally designed programs. So I believe it was about '99 that the feds came up with this program called Comprehensive School Reform Demonstration. And they identified the lowest performing schools in Oregon, and they offered them, I believe, $175,000 in their first year, but it was contingent on them picking a program. And these programs were packaged programs. And guess who were the producers and developers of these programs? These were Pearson type things, but then they became interventions. And I've seen the language change, that we're talking about kids who are not, I'll say kids who are not accessing the instruction that isn't accessible to them, but kids who are not learning at the rate that we would think need an intervention, as if they're crack addicts or something. And a lot of times it's the curriculum or the teacher that needs an intervention. But what I saw beginning to happen with Title I dollars that are earmarked for kids living in poverty is, in the name of intervention and equity and closing the achievement gap, was we now have a special program in a shrink-wrapped box for those kids. We're going to pull them out of the classroom and take them to this special little room and go low and slow and remedial for these kids. Who are these kids? As you walk through the hallways and they tell me that room 3 has the intervention for primary and room 7 has intervention for intermediate, and I walk through that elementary school, I see the future residents of these prison beds, because I'm walking in and there's not a white face in these groups. So what is that telling you? The intervention needs to happen somewhere else, and these kids are tagged as, we now call them the red, or are they the yellow, or are they the green? I get that we need some things for common language, but it's really dangerous. And when all of those kids are of color, I'm saying there's nothing wrong with those children. They were not born with a brain that didn't have capacity. There is something wrong with what we're doing and what we're using and how we're doing it. So one of my concerns is our younger teaching force is being told this by the people training them and supporting them and their mentors and their principals, and principals are hearing it from the state and the state from the feds. So there's this buy-in now that we're just trying to help the kids who are struggling. Who can argue against that? But in reality, what we're doing is we're taking them away from mainstream instruction, so they're missing grade level instruction. They're being subjected to poorly developed programs that are not scientifically research-based, because our kids, the brown and black kids, were not involved in those scientifically based research projects. So then we fold our arms and say, you can't use that program, it's not scientifically based research. And the answer is, our kids have never been in the scientifically based research that needed to happen. So the other piece that I see is teachers are being told, here's your package, here's how you teach. So teachers are not being the creative professionals they were trained to be. And so I see the teachers as the expert. When I was a principal, I would default to my teachers more than I would tell them what to do, because they were good at that craft. They need to inform me what they needed for support. And teachers are being given very scripted programs where their creativity goes out the window, and the interventions are not designed for students who are culturally or linguistically different. So we're throwing money at the problem, what we view as the problem, and it's not working, and it's not new.
So we're talking about, Sarina, I want you to
Yeah, I was just
add.
going to say that creativity and that imagination that teachers use is so inspiring to students. And when I'm in a classroom environment, that's all that matters. It's that seeing that a teacher is passionate, because how is a student going to be passionate if the teacher doesn't show that passion? And so when I'm in a classroom and we're having a meaningful discussion, that's when I'm most willing to learn and actually be involved in this issue. And so I think that's just so important, and that the fact that this is going away, it's just awful. Because if, like I said again, if a teacher isn't passionate, then how can a student be?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, and if I could just build on that, because it's hard for teachers to teach to our passion when we have to teach to a test, right?
Exactly.
And the new research that's recently been released shows that the average American public school student will take 112 standardized tests
crazy.
in their pre-K now, starting in pre-K to high school graduation. And some urban districts, like in Pittsburgh, they take 30 standardized tests in a single academic year, right, in 9 months. So when you're every month preparing for the next exam, it can consume some 16 hours a week, and teachers are no longer able to teach to their strengths or to their kids. They have to teach to the test, and they have to train students how to eliminate wrong answer choices, right? How to game the system, how to eliminate wrong answer choices rather than how to think critically. And it's not random which schools these tests are concentrated in. We know that it's the schools that serve kids of color and the schools that serve low-income students where these tests are concentrated. And the thing that really strikes me about that is that let's look at where Bill Gates sends his kids. Let's look at where Eli Broad and the Walmart family, that are some of the biggest promoters of high-stakes standardized testing. In their schools, they never inundate the classroom with these tests because they want their children to grow up to be the next leaders and to be able to develop those qualities of leadership. But for our kids, rote memorization, right, and this, education on the cheap is good enough. And I think that I've seen the same thing as students' passion come alive when I'm able to teach what I'm motivated by. And I think we need a complete transformation of this debate about what we need in education.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the tests themselves, because we're talking about the unequal intervention that's happening, and that there are certain populations of kids that are really being targeted more so. And it seems what we're doing to figure out that there is a problem is we're looking at one thing and one thing only. We're looking at test scores. And we're looking at test scores on tests that are aligned to the Common Core. I'd like to explore for a little bit with the group, to what degree do we know that these tests measure what they say they measure? To what degree, who wrote these tests? Where do they come from? Have there been research studies, longitudinal studies to show their validity? What do we know about this?
I mean, I could just start by saying a few words about what these tests measure. And I think that education researcher after education researcher has demonstrated definitively that what standardized tests measure above all else is a student's zip code. Right? It measures their access to wealth and their proximity to the dominant culture. And for that reason, we've seen throughout history these tests favor white, wealthy folks and disparage the rest of society. And in fact, they were intentionally designed to do that. And if you know the history of standardized testing and how and when it entered the public schools, you will never again fall for that terrible lie that testing is the key to closing the achievement gap, because these tests were actually brought to the public schools by proud, open eugenicists, right? This was the fake pseudoscience in the early 1900s that was an open project of trying to prove white supremacy. And so like you can take Carl Brigham, who taught at Princeton and was one of the founding fathers of eugenics in America, one of the proud white supremacists, and also the founder of the SAT exam, right? That he was proud, was a gatekeeper to keeping out black people from his institution. And you can see the stability of the test scores from the days of the open eugenicists designing them until today, right? You have, people of color and immigrants scoring the lowest and low-income folks, and then wealthy white people scoring the highest from then all the way to today. And now we're told this is the key to unleashing civil rights is more tests, right? But if you know that history, it's just absurd.
Are really designed by educators. They are really, teachers were involved in creating the standards that the tests are based on. Give us a little sense of that history about how we came to the particular brand and breed of tests that we're using in our schools now.
Well, if you look at how the Common Core was developed, so you have the Common Core standards and then the two consortiums that have the two different tests. But basically Gates Money and Achieve Corporation, that was very much tied to that, was very central to developing all that. But you have the standards themselves, and then you have the tests, and then you have the test scoring of the tests, and there are problems at every level of that. I mean, in fact, I've seen basically ads on Craigslist to either be a test scorer being paid between $11-something an hour, not even $15 an hour, to sit in a cubicle and grade essay after essay after essay. So there's a scoring part we have to question the legitimacy of, but then also there were one of those jobs for one of those companies as well for writing the test questions as well. So even that's farmed out to temp workers. And the whole point of assessment as a teacher is to get a sense of if students are understanding what you're teaching, to adjust your teaching practice. But the whole point of what we see with testing since NCLB is all about accountability, right? And as if this is a country that cares about accountability, where we have so much corruption and fraud. I mean, the latest studies show that the United States is not technically a democracy. We're an oligarchy. I mean, there's no accountability, but they've just shifted the entire thing into education, again, to set teachers up and students up that's designed to fail.
Where's the accountability for the bankers, right?
Exactly. I mean, the system's designed to fail us. And talking as a teacher, if we talk about what's happening in education, I mean, I'm really privileged that I get to work half-time and I could live. I know a lot of other people, because of the amount of student debt they have, other kind of things, they can't do that, but half-time is a decent workload. I mean, if you're talking about a full-time high school teacher teaching between 180 to 220 students, what kind of teaching can you do? I mean, how much time do you have to get to know your students, to do the kind of planning, to teach them the kind of things that you really need to teach them, or to assess them in a fair way? So, you know, imagine collecting 180 essays and reading that and giving feedback to students. I mean, it's impossible. And, you know, talking about accountability, so they're talking about raising the standards and caring about education at a time when Oregon and Washington, I mean, in Washington, they're violating the Constitution by not funding education. Oregon is like, you know, at the bottom of the barrel, like number 47 or 48 in terms of funding for students. So how is it that we're saying that we need to be accountable and we're going to use tests to be accountable at a time when we're set up to fail? I mean, structurally, because of the funding compared to the funding that used to exist for public schools. And all this serving the interests of the super wealthy, right, as we've just cut taxes after taxes after taxes.
Yeah. One of the things that's really struck me as a parent who has children in the system now, to make connections here, is how testing has taken up so much resource. So we've seen our libraries in the Portland Public Schools begin to close down, begin to have hours like we're open from 9:30 to 11:30. And then we have librarians and people who are sort of supporting the testing coordination system. And computer resources really solely dedicated to test taking. It really hit home for me last year. I have a son who has an IEP, and he was making his transition from preschool to kindergarten. And you're supposed to have a seamless experience of that, where you go in the spring and you work on the IEP and get ready. And I remember reaching out to the school and being told, I'm sorry, we can't meet with you until the day before school, because our psychologist who handles IEPs is busy testing students.
Wow.
So this kind of redirection of resource is particularly troubling for students who need this kind of extra support. Wonder what other folks are seeing along those lines in their environments.
Well, I was going to say that some of the people that are the psychiatrists that are in the schools are actually students from Portland State University. And again, they're collecting data on the issues that the students are having within the school, and then of course they're getting the capstone grants and they're using it for more funding, for more research. So what we have to understand about our school system, and really our public school system, and it's going into the charter, it's a banking system for people. If we want to be able to prioritize how our economic development over the next 25 or 30 years in America is going to be in this region, who are going to be the power industry makers, what are going to be the commodities, and how are we going to function and grow as a society. What we have to realize is that right now we're getting more money for poverty-related issues than anything else. That is the base commodity that drives our economy. That we are a commodity. As 99% of the people, we are a commodity. There are so many different issues that we're dealing with that are commoditized because of the funding that's relative to it. Our school systems that's the easiest place to do your market research on what commoditized value these people are going to provide for us. I mean, that's the reality of our situation if we look at it from a business standpoint. And when I got into activism, it was because of the trauma of, you know, tragedy and community violence, but I looked at it as, whoa, if I'm running a business, which, you know, any city in America is an incorporated system, I need to understand why I'm not getting a return on investment for the people that live in my city. And when you look at the systems as business systems and they're failing, who would continue putting money into failing systems? Who would continue to hire people that are not providing a return on investment? We turn a blind eye to it. We continue to elect people that don't have any value outside of the corporate partnerships or the lobbying values or the political agendas. And I think that when we get the outcomes that we do, where we're, you know, lacking in graduation rates across the country, or we're leading the nation in the hungriest children, that we again have to look at what are we willing to do right now about that? What are we wanting to do with the power that we actually have in this country, because there's nobody that I can name in our society right now that's actually standing up, that actually does have power, you know, from a federal standpoint or any other.
And I think, you know, in terms of your question about how these tests are draining resources, that was one of the big reasons why all my colleagues at Garfield High School voted unanimously in 2013 to refuse to administer the MAP test. And we found a power that could finally counter the powerful, right? Because we talked about how our libraries were shut down 3 times a year for weeks on end to administer this computer-based assessment. And so as a history teacher, I can't assign a research project, you know, to have the kids actually use evidence to back up a thesis and investigate something that they're interested in. That has to go out the window because they can't use the library, they can't use the computers for internet research. And that was one of the motivating factors that helped unite the entire building to vote to refuse to administer the test. And you know, we were quickly threatened with a 10-day suspension without pay by the superintendent. And you know, the Seattle Times editorialized against us, and Michelle Rhee and all the corporate reformers, you know, she wrote an op-ed in the Seattle Times saying that we just didn't want to be accountable, right? And in fact, the most beautiful thing I've ever seen happened when the entire faculty lost their fear and said, we know what best practices are. And we know how our kids learn, and we know this test isn't giving us any relevant information, it's just draining resources. You know, our reading teacher said, if I want to know how my kids are reading, I use this revolutionary technology called the book. Right? I don't have to march them down to the computer lab for hours on end to take. If they can't read the 9th grade level book, then we use the 8th grade level book and we find their level. And now I actually know what part of reading they're struggling with because I've heard them, right? And you know, we used our expertise to explain what was wrong with this exam, and then we used collective action and organizing to confront this exam. And when the students voted unanimously to support us and the PTA voted unanimously to support us, we had a block of power that actually defeated that exam. And the superintendent not only didn't suspend us, but he canceled the exam altogether for Seattle's high schools. And it really taught me a lesson. You know, they have so many advantages in terms of being the wealthiest people the world has ever known, but all of that money and power can fade in front of well-informed and you know, communities that are united.
Yeah, you inspired our whole nation when you did that, and that's where like a whole lot of my mind is like, how do we reinvent this kind of action? Because we can deal with bureaucracy, or we can use direct action and still have our accommodation for the bureaucracy. Be like, boom, shut it down now. Here's my proposal. Do it now.
There you go.
You know, and it moves a little bit faster. But I think that's the power play that we have available to us, with the parents, teachers, and students all being there for that value.
I think what's been really important to me to recognize as a parent is that teachers are facing so much, and not all teachers have had the experience of finding camaraderie in taking collective action, and to know that many teachers are really kind of under the thumb of the system to even talk about what they think about these tests, and that it's difficult for many teachers to speak out and to take action. And that's, for me as a parent, why I've recognized that it's important that parents really lead the way. And we also know that there's been a lot of this attack on unions, and teachers' unions is a big part of this, and our teachers are facing so much.
The climate is, I'm sorry. I was going to say it is a climate of fear.
Yes.
And when I ask that question, or when people talk, they describe the parking lot meetings where we get honest about how we're feeling. And I've been pondering that for a while, because we want to unite, and what is stopping us from uniting? And at this point, it's fear, but I think part of that fear is unfounded. there's almost like these myths out there about what can happen. Your
Right.
school will shut down or you'll lose funding and everybody's going to be pointing at you because you spoke out against standardized testing. And I just wanted to speak to the resource strain. The National Association for Bilingual Ed, prior to Common Core adoption, had a position paper they put out predicting that the implementation and rollout of Common Core would drain the resources, the little resource that we do have, but specifically for second language learners, and in the name of a curriculum that is not linguistically or culturally responsive. So it really amounts to an English-only approach that we saw with Reading First, which was very corporate driven in the 90s. And our families don't know this. My concern is that many of our language minority families are not as well versed or involved in schools or engaged and comfortable the way many of you are, and they don't know that. And so part of our mission is getting that word out so we can unite. I really believe it's going to have to come from parents and students.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, it's not that they don't know it just because, you know, they're ignorant. I mean, first of all, they're being lied to.
Right.
And they're so busy working that many of them don't have time to do all the extra research to see through the lies. But, you know, going back to the tests, I mean, I don't have a single piece of valuable information from all the tests that our students have done that informs me about where they're at and how I should adjust my teaching. There's no assessment value in it at all. I mean, it's all about making them feel like they're inadequate. And again, you know, it works very well for this economy, right? Where after we hold special sessions in the legislature to give away tax breaks to Nike and so forth, you know, we underfund our schools, and then students have record debt. There are not enough good jobs for people. I mean, this whole idea of the college and career readiness thing and competing in the global economy is just a joke, because, you know, we have more people that are educated now than ever before. I mean, and granted that, you know, there's a huge room for improvement there, but the people that have college degrees right now can't get jobs at that, you know, their level of education. And so instead of, there's a great part of this book in the introduction where they talk about the shift that happened, you know, the shift that happened as we start to become much more unequal in the United States in the late 70s, where they really shifted from the focus of the government being responsible for job creation to focusing on education and job training. So instead of you know, being responsible for the economy, they're trying to blame students and teachers, and how convenient to attack unions as well, right? And when we talk about global competition, I mean, Obama got Jeffrey Immelt, the CEO of not General Motors, I can't remember the name of the corporation, GE, who not only paid zero taxes, they got millions of dollars back in tax subsidies after they outsourced thousands and thousands of jobs, you know, and and he actually got Jeffrey Immelt to be the head of the Jobs and Competitiveness Council. And we're talking about accountability.
Right. I know you're talking about accountability.
Talking about TPP.
And a study came out this year that shows for the first time in at least 50 years, a majority of students attending the public schools live in poverty, right? Who will be accountable for that? Where's the politician that will be accountable to that? And instead they want to use high-stakes standardized testing to blame teachers and students and families for problems that they caused by unequal tax structures, right, and by creating poverty in this country. And they want to use standardized testing to show that teachers are inept. But teachers know that standardized tests don't really give us the information that we need to understand a student's thought process. If a student bubbles in A, what do we know about what that student knows? Did the student guess that one and get it right? Did the student actually, maybe if it's the wrong answer, but the student had a very sophisticated thought process and at the last second doubted themselves and circled that, right? Then it's hard to know how and why a student arrived at that problem, but because it's a cheap way to score, we end up using that form of assessment, and it's really backwards.
And the anxiety behind that too is just so unnecessary. It's just, there's just so much stress and anxiety that goes behind those tests. For what?
And I think that what you're talking about, the stress and the anxiety, goes very well with what GM is talking about access. And certain populations have less access to being successful on these tests. If you have a child in your class who's hungry, on top of stressed, on top of maybe has a disability, who can't use their accommodations on their IEP to take a test, who's going to be successful? It's a weighted kind of system for that. I think we've talked a little bit about the culture of fear that exists in schools now, that this kind of test and punish culture also shows up in the way that kids experience school. And I wonder if that might be a place that you might want to speak to, Sarina, a little bit. How does this culture impact you at school and the kids you see?
It makes students not willing to learn, because it's just all that stress and all that attention towards a test. But we don't even understand what the point of that test is. We aren't understanding what the purpose behind this is. We don't understand the data that's getting collected. It's just, students aren't educated on what the purpose is at all. So it's just confusing for us. And it really just, it's like, what is the issue going on here?
And I was going to say, and a lot of the children who have been through a lot of trauma living in poverty, let's say like foster care or just different displacement issues, child abuse and things like that, I've seen that it's caused a lot of anxiety in them, because they're already used to, whenever there's a problem, people paying close attention to them. Right. So when it comes to that point, I've had 7-year-olds that are saying, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do, because it's too much attention that's being paid on them, and they're like, whoa, what am I going to do wrong to make this worse? And it's a part of a life that they're already traumatized in as a child. Like, everything in my life is good or bad, and I can make it better or worse, and you're giving me this test that I better achieve. And I was in a school board meeting a couple of months ago, and they had this whole, this team that's brought in the test, and they were talking about how this year, instead of letting the teachers not understand or choose to be, aggravated by the whole situation, we're going to work with them directly so that they can help start getting the families to compromise and use this tool. And I was like, this is so bad. This is so bad.
I was going to add that Oregon, and I imagine other states, really put a lot of emphasis on participation rates. And so the directive that we're given is 100% of your kids will participate in this test. And so one of the things that we know is kids come to us from other countries, and we enroll them, and legally we serve them. So a child who shows up, who just crossed the border or came from a war-torn country, has never held a pencil, is subjected to the test the next day. What is that telling us? Is that telling us whether or not that child can read? I remember sitting down with a high school Russian student and just having 5 books, no language in common, but I had a book with a duck on the cover and big font, another book that was a short chapter book, a high school level book, and an adult book. And I just put them in front of him, and he grabbed the book, and I knew something about his prior education. We have to know these things about kids before we subject them to that. So Oregon is asking us to take a child who does not know the meaning of the word hi, or yes or no, and to put them in front of this test. So just an example, when we look at SBAC, our statewide test, nobody did well. So when we look at all students for English language arts, just over half of our students passed. But when we look at kids who are limited English proficient, 10% passed. So that doesn't tell me anything but how little or how much English the kids know. The same for math, and they say math is universal, you don't need language, etc. In Oregon, 40% of our kids passed the math standard, 9% of second language learners. So those discrepancies right there. So what is inclusion?
And they use it to humiliate students
and
intimidate them, traumatize them. I mean, did you see the John Oliver show when he had the segment on testing, and he says, we have a problem when there is a protocol written in place for what to do when a child throws up on the test.
Wow.
Right. because it happens so often because of the
know it.
stress. You know, and I think your generation is having to figure out how to cope with that.
It's the stress and it's the pressure too. It just seems like there's always this pressure on us and we don't know what to do about it.
So I want to talk a little bit about the threat that creates the fear. And you know, Teressa, you had a great point, and Jesse talked about it. We can get beyond the fear and collectively say, you know, we're going to stand up, that you start to see things happen. I want to talk about the reality of the threats and how many are empty and how they're being used. So one thing is to think about the federal participation guidelines. I often hear when I'm talking to people about opting their children out, that there's this guideline that exists federally that says that 95% of schools, of kids, they need to be participating or funding will be lost. Can we talk a little bit about how many schools have lost funding for lack of participation in these tests? Am I right?
Yeah.
0?
That's right. That's right. I mean, there are real high stakes attached to these exams that we should be aware of in terms of you can deny students graduation based on failing these tests. Oftentimes schools are shut down when the scores go down, like in Chicago, where 50 schools were closed with the stroke of a pen, and they, you know, choose the schools that they say were labeled failing based on
So let me
these
make
scores.
sure I understand that. You're talking about scores are low and they close schools, not
That's
people
right.
don't participate in the
right.
tests.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So actually participating in their game,
Thank you.
participating in the tests are what actually does the most harm to your school, right?
So no schools have been closed for opting out?
That's right. In New York State, they had over 200,000 families opt their kids out of the test last spring in the biggest revolt against high stakes testing ever, right? And you know, they had in some districts very large percentages, over 10% opt out, and not a single school has had funding revoked because they didn't have enough students taking the test. And that's because they know that would only fuel the opt-out movement. If you're punishing us for actively intervening in our child's education and saying what we think is best for them, that would only enrage communities and bring more people out. And so there is this arcane language in No Child Left Behind and the new federal education policy, Every Student Succeeds Act, that says you need to have 95% of kids taking these tests, but no one's actually been punished because of the backlash they know. And this uprising is real. As scary as the threats are, people are rising up across the country. And the thing that inspires me the most is the students who are really taking the education into their own hands in mass walkouts. I mean, Chicago had some of the first, well, Oregon actually here in Portland had some of the first big walkouts against the tests, and then Chicago, and then Colorado, I think, had the largest opt-outs in U.S. history, the largest walkouts of students. And then in New Mexico, I was really inspired by that one last year because it was at schools that were like 90 to 100% Latino students who marched out of their school during the Common Core testing with signs that said, "I'm more than a score." And you know, they know that education has to have a much bigger purpose than just filling in bubbles, and they're fighting back.
And there's such a disconnect between this reality and what we experience as parents, because I'll tell you, as soon as the testing window comes open, I'm going to get a letter from my principal that tells me that if I don't allow my child to participate in these tests, that there will be this federal guideline that could close our school down. That could, you know, and so I think it's so important that parents realize it hasn't happened and it's not going to happen. And I think, you know, the other piece is for us here in Oregon, we had House Bill 2655 last year. So this was a bill introduced to help parents to opt out with less harassment, with less of this. And so it's been put in place this year, and it's come out from the state with materials that are still designed to harass and coerce parents. And so now to sign this form, I have to say that I realize that I am leading to, that my action is leading to inequitable distribution of funding. And I have to sign something that says that I realize that I'm losing valuable information. So I think what's so important is for parents to realize we are being harassed here.
That's right.
We know we're losing valuable information, and we know that we are not responsible for the inequitable distribution of funds, and that it isn't happening.
That's right.
The other thing I think is really important is that not all states like Oregon even have a bill like this, but we do have the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
That's right.
You want to talk a little bit
Well,
about that?
no, I was just going to say, and I lost my thought. I'm sorry, because I got excited off of
You got excited.
No, you can finish what you were saying.
Well, we do have the 14th Amendment, which really allows parents the right to have a say in what's happening for their children. And we know that in states all across the country that don't have opt-out laws, that people can refuse the test, and they do refuse the test. And this is a movement that's happening everywhere. There's case law that supports this as well. We have to remember.
And that's why I wanted to say that right now, there's a revolution that's going on, and it's a human rights movement, and it's a civil rights movement. And when we start identifying our rights that are being violated, that's where we have a power to break this system a lot faster than dealing with the bureaucracy and hoping that the elected figures will do what they say they want to do. We have that power. I mean, when you think about having a partnership with student unions and teacher unions and parents, what does that unity and necessity need to look like? All it is sharing information, debunking the myths, making that information available in different languages to different groups, letting them translate the information. I work with a lot of students on different college campuses, and I'm telling them, like, if your campus has 2,000 or if you have 30,000 people, you have so many different groups that are going from campus to campus, different universities that are already partnered, where you can just distribute information to them tactfully, and you guys can have a revolution just by informing one another. And we have that same power. All these different PTAs, let's just talk about even what you plan to do with this discussion here. The distribution of information about these things is our biggest tool. That's our most powerful resource. But it has to be used intentionally to break it.
But you remember what Arne Duncan said about this opt-out movement. He said it's just suburban white moms who are upset that the tests show that their kids aren't as brilliant as they thought they were. And I mean, what a disparaging, just despicable comment. First of all, I think suburban white moms have a right to have their kids not be reduced to a test score. But I also thought that comment really hid the fact that communities of color are increasingly organizing and fighting back.
That's right.
Right, and that, I talked about, the students in New Mexico, but students in Baltimore, I went to speak on my book there the week Freddie Gray was beaten and killed. And the Baltimore Algebra Project had just organized a sit-in at the school board of black students demanding that they not shut down their schools, right? And you have leaders like Karen Lewis of the Chicago Teachers Union, who's a black woman leading the fight against standardization and high-stakes testing. And there's just so many examples because of how these tests are specifically used to punish communities of color, and they're increasingly organizing and fighting back. And I think one important point that I think we should emphasize here is the way these tests are used to maintain a school-to-prison pipeline.
That's
right? And there's a study that came out of Boston University that shows the only outcome of exit exams, right, having high-stakes tests determine whether you can graduate or not, is increased incarceration rates. And those are the kind of things that educators have known for a long time, but more and more families and communities are rising up and fighting back against.
One of the things that you hear a lot is people who oppose the tests just don't want their children to work hard. And one of the pieces that I think is so critical to understanding the school-to-prison pipeline is how data is used and how these tests are really creating data sets, and data privacy is a huge issue with us. So maybe we can talk a little bit about where is this data going and how is it being used, and then make the connections to some of the social justice movements that we're talking about that are concerned with the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing about that before when Teressa was talking about that too. You know, as I said, I have no assessment information from any of the tests my students have taken. But as soon as kids take those tests on the Google Chromebooks, Google Corporation has all that information that they're collecting longitudinally, like data that they've never had before. I mean, these kinds of corporations, Facebook, Google, Twitter, I mean, they don't produce anything, right? All they do is take data and are data brokers and sell this data, and they're worth hundreds of billions of dollars. So right before Common Core happened, they changed FERPA, the federal regulations on student and family privacy. And so there's a bit that's unknown about what they can do, I think, and that's, I think, why that they made that change. And there was this major fight back against, Gates had, one of his projects was a company, I forget the name of it, that was In Bloom, to collect data and broker in data, and because of resistance from parents and students and teachers, that fell apart. But still, there's Lumina, there's Google, now Google Education, the Chromebooks, all that, and then also I forget, Rupert Murdoch has his Amplify with tablets. I mean, it's all about the money.
I think that point about Rupert Murdoch is interesting too. A lot of times parents will say to me, but I don't hear about what you're talking about in the mainstream media. You think about Rupert Murdoch and I wonder why.
They
the mainstream
own it.
media. So it's so important that we have these opportunities for people to hear the real story.
Well, I'm thinking back to the civil rights movement and how there were, how they're using the language to propagandize the values of the people that would be affected by these tests. Like they're talking about the suburban white woman, and then they're saying the lazy black people in the hoods. But during the civil rights movement, those communities came together. There were, very elite families that were supporting the movement. There were different faith-based organizations that were coming in and providing substantial value, whether it was legal support, monetary support, transportation, whatever it was. Communities were coming together and doing their part, and they were going over their economic and class lines. And I think that's what we need to do now, and we have to, because if we look at the people that live in places like Lake Oswego, at some point they're going to understand that the outcomes for the children that are taking these tests, that aren't graduating, that are living in poverty, that those people that live in poverty, their children are going to be affected by it if they're not super rich. If you think that there's still a middle class situation that's going to keep you off of the scale of poverty, we're learning that right now in Portland with our situation with the gentrification. People that moved here 10 and 15 years ago are saying, wait a minute, now I'm being pushed out? I thought that this is for, a mecca for me. And it's like, no, this is a situation, and we're commoditizing any opportunity that we can in order to build sustainability for our situation. But it's not for poor people. It's not for disabled people. It's not for people of color. This is for a priority class. And we have to look at that. And if we don't want that, we have to start building those relationships. I was talking to a friend the other day, and she said, well, there's some really rich people that want to help your movement. And I said, well, tell them we need paper so that we can distribute information, because our biggest value is being able to hand off information. If someone arrests any of our protesters, or if we get shut down before we're able to make known what our campaign is about, then we lose the value of the sacrifice. Our biggest necessity is distribution of information. I'm going to keep saying that.
And I think I remembered along those lines that Bill Gates invested millions of dollars just in the marketing campaign for the Common Core.
Yeah.
So we're up against, quite a bit here.
And not just that, but he actually has bankrolled the Seattle Times education reporting now. And we know that Eli Broad is bankrolling the education reporting in Los Angeles with the LA Times. And so they are now directly purchasing newspapers, education reporting sections. And of course they say, well, we don't take direct orders from Bill Gates about what to publish or not, but they also know if they were to do a series of stories about how Gates Foundation is undermining public education, that money would quickly dry up.
Right.
And so he doesn't need to give the orders, and it is incredible how they have just completely shut out the voices, but it's also amazing how we've pushed ourselves to the front regardless.
We can shut down
right?
stuff. We can boycott as families, as communities.
And it's having an impact. I mean, look at, Obama took No Child Left Behind and put it on steroids with the Race to the Top program and the Common Core standards, and yet he had to go on, he went on his Facebook account and recorded a little video a couple weeks ago saying, we have way too much testing in this country, right? He didn't quite link the dots together that his policies had created that number of 112 standardized tests. But the fact that he had to admit that this thing has gone way too far is a testament to the power of organizing.
Absolutely.
And yet I think understanding that that's a message and that there's talk and there's action is another, really important thing. I think one of his statements was there should be no more than 2% of testing. Well, what does that really mean? And when we look at the ESSA, the recent reauthorization of the legislation, it really doesn't look that much different than much of what we saw with No Child Left Behind. So we have to look beyond the words to what's actually happening here.
Well, it's interesting to talk about the advertising for the Common Core, because like when you talk about the Broads wanting to influence the LA Times and news media in LA, precisely at the same time when they're planning on spending $490 million to expand charter schools in LA, right?
That's right.
Or think about another major supporter of Common Core. You can find on at least YouTube, you could find some videos of these advertisements from ExxonMobil and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I mean, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the most powerful corporate lobby in the world, representing the most powerful corporations that represent the wealthy and are the last people that care about equity. I mean, similar to the Walton family, who the members of the family own as much wealth as like 40% of Americans, right? Just the members of that family alone. But I think all these corporations are spending this money precisely because the people and ultimately democracy and education, which is central to democracy, is such a threat. This is kind of a long thing, but for me, I think it's really interesting to go back and look at the 60s, right? When we had the civil rights movement, we had student activism, and the 1% was completely threatened by that.
Yeah.
And not only the 1%, the segregationists who were forced to desegregate the schools, they were totally threatened by that. So they joined forces and got together with all this money to try to destroy the public education, to especially attack students because they were really concerned about student activism. I highly recommend looking up Lewis Powell and the famous Powell memo. I mean, he wrote this. He was basically a corporate lawyer that worked for tobacco companies, and then he was appointed by Nixon as Supreme Court Justice. But he wrote this memo to someone in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about how capitalism is under attack, corporations are under attack. They felt like they were under attack by the media, by liberals, by radicals on university campuses, and so on. And so they were basically strategizing about how they can start foundations like the Heritage Foundation, Scafee Foundation, take over the media, and use the Supreme Court for the right-wing corporate agenda, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And so all this is happening because they see education and democracy and the people as a threat to what they're trying to do. And so we're seeing this come back again, that in education and through democracy and through renewing the civil rights movement and so on, we are fighting back, and they're having to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to try to squash us, but they're going to lose.
I think what I notice is this preponderance of sort of using the civil rights language to kind of justify education reform. And I'll speak to that just from the standpoint of being the mother of children with disabilities. You know, when I go out into the disability community, the place where I expect, you know, something different, what I hear is, we want our children to be able to take these tests just like everyone else, so that they can be afforded the same opportunities. Sort of that this is about inclusion, that this is about, you know, and so I think that sometimes we find that the language of civil rights and inclusion is being sort of turned around to change reality. And I have to step back and say, my kid doesn't have access to those tests in a way that's meaningful for him. So, and how is this going to allow him to achieve his potential, you know, when the data is being collected and who knows what happens with that. So I think, you know, it's interesting to talk about, I think we need to recognize that the reform movement is using the language of civil rights and equity and closing the achievement gap, and wonder if people have other things to say about that.
I was going to say we need to be on the break the system movement. I don't think that the reform movement was ever a situation where we were going to achieve any type of success, because basically what I learned from the 60s and just even recently, you know, this coming Martin Luther King holiday that's coming up in January is the 30th annual since the holiday was created as a national holiday. And I was looking at some newspapers from 1986 the other day, and everything in '86 was about Jesse Jackson, the Rainbow Coalition, and all these different activities that were happening. But on all of the different headlines, you saw forgive, 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 forgive. So I guess because the holiday was coming up, we were supposed to forgive all of the inequities of the civil rights era and all of the inequities of America's past and everything else, and we were supposed to move into this brand new future. And so all of the words and hateful things, like I'm looking at a 1986 Ebony magazine with Dr. King on every other page wearing handcuffs and saying extremely radical, militant, valuable, necessary words. He didn't acquiesce on any of the pages, and it was damn near a full magazine of Dr. King and everything that had happened in the civil rights movement. And out of all of those images, I knew that there were less than 1% that were relative to today's society. I knew that a lot of the language had been condensed into certain quotes, and we were propagandizing, again, that movement in order to suit the necessity of, okay, everything else is okay, and we should be all right, and we're going to mediate and behave yourself and contain your situation so that we can move forward. We're not moving forward. We have to be intentional about breaking down a system, dismantling language, and replacing it, because that's where that civil rights movement that we had stopped. I talked to civil rights leaders about the 50th anniversary a couple of years ago of the March on Washington, and they were talking about how in their 20s they were already being trained up in their communities to be organizers. They were being trained to be organizers in their churches, in their schools, in their different student activity groups. We didn't do that. We get kids that are going to college campuses and they're figuring out how to organize through their student unions, that some of them don't have a whole basis of what was done last time, or, you know, anything that's substantial to create a new foundation. We have to be intentional about that. It's not going to fall out of the sky, and if everybody owns all of our media outlets, we're going to have to start thinking of ways to shut that down as well. And we know that through the power of blogs and things like we were talking about Snapchat. You can start, I mean, they had a fake event page in Chicago about Rom, and people showed up and shut it down. A fake page for an event. So
I just wanted to say, of course, I'm thinking a lot about Oregon and what's next. Excuse me. I think part of it is raising awareness. Back to what Teressa was saying, I've got to distribute information, but in ways that speak to the interest. So I think of the special ed parents.
Yes.
What is the messaging that is going to speak to them in ways that are meaningful for their kids? And specifically, I think of our language minority family. Spanish-speaking students are the fastest growing population, Hispanic students in Oregon. And we always, from the Oregon Department of Ed right down to the schools, to those of us who try to organize things and bring people together, I think we overlook where people are, and we're not all in the same place. There's always exceptions, but if you did not go to school in this country as a child and you came as an adult bringing your child, you've got a different context.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of scaffolding that needs to happen. I remember sitting in a room with parents being told, we're going to do attendance, enrollment balancing for the district to balance FTE, and they were told all these things and it was all translated. And when we sat in the room, I just asked, does everybody know what today's meeting is about? They had just had an hour-long presentation in Spanish. And they said, no, we were just told there's a meeting tonight and we need to be here.
Childcare.
And so to be able to sit down and say, and I found out that this wasn't insulting. Did you know that in America, schools are geographically defined, and where you live determines where you go to school. Some of our schools are too big, some are too small. That's our problem right now,
Yes.
and that's what we're talking about. Oh, the whole room said. So I think part of it has to, I have found myself learning from my own parents telling me, Maestra, we didn't know that coming to school was a good thing for parents to do. We come from a village where if you were to walk in the school doors, that's disrespecting teachers. So you just need to tell us that, and please tell that to our neighbors. And so knowing that you have a right to question your school and bringing the parents together. The other piece is they're isolated. Our ESL parents, our parents of ESL students are not brought together, and when they are, in the name of we want to hear their voice, they're manipulated.
Yeah.
It's very oppressive.
Yeah.
And the form that Dana described that our state is using, that opt-out form, guarantees that no language minority family is going to sign that. I know just from being Latina and working with the Mexican culture long enough that there is an over-reliance of trust on the part of authorities, the school system. The teacher knows what's best. I wouldn't
Especially
question
if they're
that.
undocumented, right?
Right.
I mean,
You have the fear of undocumentation and some bullying going on
right.
Yeah.
in very many ways. You're not going to question it. So where do we start? We don't start with talking about corporate interests in
That's it.
education, because that doesn't matter. So the messages that we need to craft depend on who's listening. And what our language minority parents need to hear is this is an English-only movement, and language is a civil right.
That's right.
What we need to do is target our bilingual schools. Oregon has so many dual immersion programs starting. What you have there is English-speaking parents who knew how to get their kids in that program. Minority families who were fortunate enough and just landed there many times because of the neighborhood. Bring these folks together and tell them that your child in 3rd grade who's been taught to read and write in Spanish will be tested in English.
Yeah.
Get those English-speaking parents together with the Spanish-speaking parents and hold hands. So that's the work I think that's ahead of us with the hard-to-reach groups, and that's why we're not unified and we don't have a unified voice. We're separated. It's what some folks call the plantation model.
Segregated.
Is not an accident.
That's right. And I think even parents who have fewer barriers to accessing, understanding what's happening are also having issues really connecting the dots between what are the things they're not happy about that are happening at school, and what does it have to do with reform. So when parents are complaining about, all of a sudden my kid has all this homework that they're coming home with. She said she didn't learn this in school. She's got 6 pages of worksheets. What is this about? I think connecting the dots between what is the daily experience that you're having and how does this relate to how these changes are showing up in school.
And how many parents are saying, what's wrong with my child
Right.
during those homework times?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right in terms of the way they sell this as a civil rights project. The more and more corporatized style of education is your civil right, and it takes messaging in a lot of different ways to different communities to undermine that basic lie. They usually do that. Sometimes they slip, like Scalia, Justice Scalia this past week when he said, well, black kids should go to the slow track schools, right? Just, in an open throwback to the eugenicists. But I think really what we've seen throughout U.S. history is that the school systems have been promised to be the great equalizer, right, from the beginning. This was going to be the way that you could advance and get ahead. And throughout U.S. history, in fact, what they've done is reproduced inequality and continued to maintain the rigid economic structure that we have that has so few with so much of the resources. And that basic contradiction of the school system promising so much and delivering so little is why they've been such an explosive site of struggle throughout history. And I think why we can't cede them to the corporations and why we should see them as great sites of hope, because my students last year, when Mike Brown was shot down and the day that Darren Wilson was not indicted, you know, they took to the streets and they knew that our school systems exist in a larger social system that doesn't value their lives, and they are making all kinds of connections right now, and I think it's an exciting struggle to be a part of.
So one of the things that we hear as we go out and talk about the problems with education reform is, well, we know what you're not for, but what are you for? What do we know about how we can assess children and have a sense of where they are that really helps educators and that really helps us know how they're progressing? How can we be building high expectations for our students without using these measures? So I think we have teachers here who can really speak to that. Let's talk about that.
Well, you know, just one thing right away. I mean, nobody freaks out about that at the private schools, expensive private schools that Obama or Arne Duncan or Bill Gates, any of them send their own kids to, where they don't do any of that testing. But I think more importantly, I mean, like what we saw last year in Jefferson County, where students walked out over the changes to the history curriculum. So it's not just about testing, but it's about you know, what students should be learning. And in a way, the testing drives that, right? The testing, the corporate textbook publishers and the standards that they make limit what students can learn and what teachers can teach. And I think that's exactly what they're trying to do. And so, you know, what do they do at any of these private schools that are, you know, where there's no accountability, right? That people expect that they're high quality schools. Well, teachers have a lot of autonomy. They have a lot of planning time. They have reasonable workloads. I mean, if you interview teachers anywhere in the country right now, the number one issue for all of them is workload.
Yes. Absolutely.
And the testing is just kind of facilitates that, right? All the corporate canned curriculum, you set it up so that students and teachers are set up to fail. They don't have the time to plan. They don't have the time to do the kind of teaching that they should be doing and that they want to be doing. And so they're just going to pick up the canned scripted curriculum, use that, use the tests and so forth. But to do real teaching means that you get to know your students, you get to know the community, you get to think about what's happening in the world, what's going to excite your students, what's going to feel relevant to them, and you come up with creative ways to engage students and teach them.
Yes.
And that takes time. There's no formula for that. And all these people that send their kids to these expensive, exclusive private schools, they know that because that's exactly what they pay for.
Yeah. And I think that we need assessment in our schools. Assessment is a vital tool for me to be able to understand the barriers my students have to gaining a certain concept and really mastering it. And I actually want accountability too. I want a system that's accountable to educating low-income students and students of color, right? It's just that high-stakes standardized tests can't deliver that. So we do have to talk about what can deliver that. And I think there's some really interesting models that are being practiced right now in innovative districts around the country that we should do more research and take a longer look at. There's a network of schools in New York known as the Consortium Schools for Performance-Based Assessment. And this is a network of some 30 schools in New York City. And they have a waiver and they don't have to administer the state standardized tests. So by the measure of the testocracy, as I call them, these should be the very worst schools in New York City, right? They have to be, right? Because they don't have the key accountability measure that you would need to provide a quality education. The only problem for the testocracy is that these are the very best schools in New York City by almost every measure that matters. They have the highest graduation rates. Their kids go to college at much higher rates than the rest of the schools. They stay in college. The longer term studies show that they actually stay in college longer than the rest of the general population of New York City schools. They have shrunk what they refer to as the achievement gap, which is better understood as an opportunity gap, I believe. But they have like some 86% of black graduates being accepted into college. Incredible figures, right? And they do this with a performance-based assessment model, which I think is important to understand what real quality assessment could look like. And they get this at like the PhD level, at the highest level of education. They don't want to know, can you fill in a bubble, right? They don't want to know, can you guess or eliminate wrong answer choices well? They want to know, can you make an argument and can you back it up with evidence, right? And that's what they do. So you know, at the PhD level, you defend your dissertation. And that's what they do at the consortium schools. They have kids create a thesis, and then they have to do look for evidence. If the evidence doesn't match the thesis, they have to revise the thesis, and at the end of the term, they defend their thesis like a PhD candidate would. And they actually bring in people from the community. And that's the part that I think, you said this so important is, let's look at what our community values,
assets,
right?
yes.
And then let's bring in those people. And so if you're in a language arts class, they'll bring in a journalist or an author from New York City who can give you feedback on your work. And then the test, instead of being time away from learning, this hours and endless hours away from learning,
They're the same thing.
right? It's actually this incredible, it can be times of incredible breakthrough where you present your understanding and you hear from somebody in that field who says, did you think about it this way, right? And now you actually are building on what you knew through the assessment. And that is an incredible model that you can't know about, because if you did, right, none of these communities would accept this cheap standardized testing model.
And it can't be put in a box. It can't be
That's
sold.
right.
Yeah.
And you
That's
know
right.
what is interesting? My answer to what is it that we want is authentic, teacher-driven
Yes.
Yes.
tests. I am for
Assessment.
assessment that informs instruction, and that usually is created by teachers. But now I'm struck because when you said performance-based assessment, it took me back to prior to the Common Core. I had worked in 2 of the largest districts, including Portland Public, where we had an initiative to train and implement a performance-based assessment. One of these districts thought we could do it overnight, and so we said we're going to get this cohort of teachers and send them out, etc. Oh yeah, and let's engage the community real quick on that. Boom, it just was all over the place. Because performance-based assessment is huge, and it goes back to the resources. If done well, it is the exact right thing to do.
Right.
We can't do it because we're taking all of our resources and investing in the Common Core. So both of these very large districts that were so excited to move forward with performance-based assessment stopped because Common Core came along.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's I had an experience this week that I want to share with you as we kind of wind this down that really shows me, that really connects to this. So I went to the State Board of Education meeting here in Oregon, in Salem, and one of the board members was reading from a report that talked about how, I think it was from U.S. News, U.S.
World Report.
Yeah, World Report. And he was talking about how we actually do less testing here than they do in countries like Finland, that we know are very well known for their really, the excellent outcomes that they get from education. But then as he went on, he said, but you know what? They actually do more testing, and it's teacher-led testing as opposed to what we're doing here. But he wasn't even making the connection Yes, that's the key. That's the key. When a teacher can get in there and work with students and really understand in a way that's about a connection with a live person, that assessment leads to better outcomes.
Yeah, and you know, I'm so fortunate to attend a school where I can have those meaningful relationships with my teacher, and I can get extra help, and I have those meaningful discussions, and I get to explore my academic passions. And that really needs to be the case for all students, because I have that confidence in myself and in my school and in my teachers that I know that I can get where I need to be and I can be successful. And that's what I'll need. That needs to be the case for all students, without a doubt.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think even our language about this has been so dominated by just the accountability, ranking and sorting people, that we forget what assessment's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be testing what people think about testing. I mean, we talk about preparing our kids for college. Well, what do they do in college? I mean, they have a paper conference with their professor, right? And also, I think in terms of assessment, another really valuable thing is for students to do self-assessments. Have a portfolio of their work.
Right.
Yeah.
Look at what they've learned, what they found meaningful and valuable, and reflect on that. So we have to change our whole perspective of assessment, not being dominated by ranking and sorting, to compare people, to figure out who's going to deserve to, basically lose out in this unfair economy, and think about, education as being part of human development, and people learning things and finding the joy of learning, and learning to be a member of society and a democratic society, rather than this very narrow kind of fitting into the economic system.
And I'm sorry, I wanted to say that one of the tools that I think we have right now as a society is the inclusion of STEM in our education systems. And I'm thinking that if we can get past the bureaucracy of them wanting to control what that looks like and give that power to the teachers so that they can use it as an innovative tool, I think that we'll bring back the value of social studies. Because when I was in middle school, social studies was so massive. We were learning everything about currency and language and tradition and education from every part of the world. I mean, this was like extreme geographic, demographics, like everything that you needed to understand the people that occupied our earth was in a social studies class. And I'm just thinking, like, we would write essays about one period of time or one era, or about a certain way to exchange commodity from one region to the next. And we would have to write essays on it, and we would stand there and we would read those essays, and that was our assessment in determining how we were able to understand that information. But it was so informational, because every essay that you heard, even if it was based on one subject matter, gave you a clear understanding of how they developed their perception of that subject matter. And it just made you want to learn more. Like, we would grab encyclopedias, and we didn't have Google back then, but we had encyclopedias, and we were turned on by the different relativity factors based on one subject matter. And I'm thinking that with STEM and with this education revolution, that's a power tool for teachers. You guys can use it in all different types of ways if you're given the power to manage it, because I mean, extreme social studies coming back and using application and assessments. That's what we learned. I mean, we were doing essays in 3rd grade.
So folks, I hate to do this because we could go on for hours, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to challenge you to say, before we close, what has not been said that really needs to be said?
There was one thing that I wanted to bring up earlier, is, again, thinking about what's happening as we focus, myopically on accountability, what's happening outside. Schools now are as segregated as they were in the 60s. And so again, we have this extreme inequality happening, and we're somehow thinking that if we just have these new standards and new tests, we're going to fix everything. And so we have to look at that, and we have to, as we struggle to improve education, we have to also think about what's happening outside. And those two things, education and the rest of our society, our economy, and so forth, has to match. And there's some huge problems outside the classroom that we need to deal with.
I'll ponder. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, over the summer, I got an opportunity to debate Peter Cunningham, who was a former Assistant Secretary of Education under Arne Duncan. And we sparred on the testing question. And then his blog, financed by the billionaires, came out with a post saying how childish our slogan, "More than a score," is. Of course students are more than a score, they said, but don't we need tests in our society? Because think about it, if we don't have a swimming test, then you'd throw a kid in the deep end and they'd drown. And I said, that's exactly the kind of test we need. That's the kind of test I'm for. A swimming test is a performance-based assessment, right? We want to actually see what these kids can do and what they know, not can they eliminate wrong answer choices. And because there are real high stakes, not just the ones that they have attached to the test to degrade students' lives, but we are living in a deeply troubled society. There are more black people behind bars than were slaves on plantations in 1850. That is a mass social catastrophe in the United States, the largest jailer in world history. And if education doesn't have anything to say about that, then it's not relevant to the students who are being funneled into that mass incarceration system, right? We have the largest income inequality in U.S. history, and we have climate change threatening the very future of human civilization. And education has to be about empowering our students to solve those problems, or it's not relevant and purposeful. And that is really, I think, what we're tasked with in this fight to defend and transform public education.
That's it.
Yeah. Any other last words from our panel members?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Education really needs to be about empowering us and giving us confidence, because without that, where can we go? And how's my future going to look? We really need to stop all the negativity. It has to be positive. Everything that's going on in education, it has to become positive. It really needs to be towards empowering us and giving us confidence.
Absolutely, and I'm with Jesse on this. We have to stop mass incarceration, and we have to use education as the tool to do that, because again, they're identifying from these tests and from a lot of the social circumstances, they're identifying our future jailed residents through our education system. That's where they're seeing how they can accommodate these beds in these prisons, and that's just malicious in its intent. But we have to be intentional in our intent to offset that. And when we fight for education, we do need to understand that there is a relativity factor between the education system and the prison system, and break them down.
Yeah. I do want to say something. I guess what I'm pondering is the what's next. I ask myself, and perhaps anybody viewing this, to reflect on what's mine to do. I'm not a parent, and I'm not in the classroom right now. But as a trained administrator and a former teacher and someone who doesn't have to drive the kids to soccer, what is mine to do? And I think that's a message that we need to share with a lot of important people. And like I said, where my heart is this growing population of second language learners in our state whose parents are not even accessing the background information, much less what is going on politically and what damage is being done. So what is mine to do? And what is yours to do if you are a parent of a child in a bilingual program and you know your child is playing with kids who don't speak English in their homes? What is yours to do? And so I guess that's my closing thought. What is ours to do?
Yeah.
Right on.
And I think for our viewers, I hope that one thing that you can see from our panel discussion here today is that this resistance movement is really about more than the topics of testing and education reform. This is really about what kind of a world we want to live in, what kind of a society we want for our children, and how we can be involved in positive change, really thinking about that. I also want to let you know, viewers, that this public service announcement was brought to you by Parents Across America, Oregon, and that as we end, you will receive lots of information that will help you figure out how you can get more connected and get get more involved. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.